Good afternoon. I'm Fred Kemp. I'm President and CEO of the Atlantic Council, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the launch of Scaling Trust on the Web, the comprehensive final report of the Digital Forensic Research Lab's Task Force for a Trustworthy Future Web. The report launches at a moment of great global uncertainty and growing interest in the role technology will play in our future. I actually wrote these comments first through ChatGPT, but because it was so much better than my own comments, I decided to go with mine. The work of this task force and the impressive community of scholars, practitioners, and innovators it represents provides us a roadmap for navigating this moment in ways that will allow us to build more resilient democracies and brighter futures. It's no surprise that it was the Digital Forensic Research Lab and its Democracy and Tech Initiative that convened this work. The Atlantic Council's DFRLab remains a groundbreaking organization with technical and policy expertise on disinformation, connective technologies, democracy, and the future of digital rights. The Atlantic Council prides itself on undertaking innovative new projects. Many of them have landed and become one of our 16 programs and centers. There's none we're more proud of than Digital Forensic Research Lab. As a field builder, it has grown the community of experts around the globe and here in the United States, able to document and make sense of the information environment and connective technologies through which the world engages. As these technologies become more present and complex, the work of the lab and its partners will only grow in importance. Certainly here at the Atlantic Council, we find ourselves grappling with the geopolitical implications of these technological changes in every one of our 16 programs and centers. Whether looking at the future of defense, the future of energy, the future of the transatlantic relationship, the bilateral China-US future, questions around climate change, global resilience, it touches on them all. I'm excited to hear from today's panelists about the findings of this report and how it can be used to help us execute the Atlantic Council's stated mission, shaping the global future together alongside partners and allies. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to thank the Atlantic Council leadership responsible for this body of work. First, Kat Duffy, the task force's director and a visiting senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council, who led a fast-paced, timely, and rigorous initiative. DFR Lab's senior director and our Atlantic Council Vice President of Technology Programs, Graham Brookie, deserves particular recognition for growing the DFR Lab into a robust center it is today. And finally, the Democracy and Tech Initiative's Director, Rose Jackson, who initiated this task force and leads a team working to ensure the ways that technology is funded, the ways it is built, and the ways it is governed and how that can reinforce rather than undermine open societies. And of course, thank you to all of us joining today in our headquarters here at the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C. and all around the world. With that, I'm pleased to pass the floor to Rose Jackson to kick us off. Thanks again for being here.
Thank you, Fred, and to all of you here with us today. We started the Democracy and Tech Initiative just over 2 years ago because we believe how technology is funded, built, and governed to be one of the most important questions of our generation. We set out to fill what we saw as a gap in how people were approaching questions of technology. That's to say, either sitting in siloed conversations, failing to knit together foreign and domestic equities, or distinct policy areas like privacy and competition, or simply ignoring the systemic nature of the internet itself and the impact that choices around it can have on society. Technology mediates nearly every aspect of our lives at this point. It's how we buy things, learn things, connect with family, access government services, and exercise our democratic rights. To date, we've done so largely through privately held companies, many of which are headquartered here in the United States. Influencing these digital spaces and platforms has also become a key point of competition for governments. And since the internet is systemic and interconnected, whatever set of interests dominates that single internet impacts everyone, including here in the United States. Core to our work is creating new and trusted spaces for difficult and urgent conversations that require the insights of a wide range of people and perspectives. This task force is in many ways the embodiment of what we set out to accomplish through our program. It centers human rights. It focuses on the next phase of technology and the trends that are shaping it. It includes voices and perspectives from around the world. It breaks down silos of industry and issue areas, and it elevates diverse leaders with cross-cutting expertise. At the DFRLab, we spend a lot of time advising democratic governments on how to think about and approach technology both collectively and within their national borders. But it can sometimes feel like we're debating yesterday's challenges while the future is being constructed before us. Now, while we believe that governments must set rules and standards to ensure that the rights we expect offline translate to our networked world, it's clear that the speed of technological change is outstripping the ability of governments to set those standards. And so we've been searching for opportunities to focus on what can be done to proactively inform this next phase, both within the companies that are making decisions every day about the products and policies that shape our lives, and the external community of civil society experts and researchers that companies and governments alike rely on for their perspective and expertise. I'm grateful to Eli Sugarman and both the Hewlett Foundation and Schmidt Futures for giving us the opportunity to explore these themes in partnership with an exceptional group of people in an action-oriented manner. Our hope is that this report and the collective insights of our task force can serve as a jumping-off point for many of you to carry forward this urgent work together. It's now my pleasure to introduce you to Kat Duffy, who took on the Herculean task of coordinating the collective wisdom of 40 task force members, more than 30 contributing experts, and 15 partner organizations into tangible, actionable insights. That she did this in less than 5 months speaks to her superhuman energy and mastery of this endlessly complex topic. Personally, allow me the opportunity to say that to do work of consequence with people you respect and count as friends is a great blessing. Now, before I pass to Kat, a reminder that you can find the full report and annexes on our website and keep updated on subsequent events by following us at DFRLab on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram using the hashtag #ScalingTrust. And you can find many of our team and task force members talking about this on Blue Sky, T2, and Mastodon. Please find us there. Now, without further ado, let's get this started. Kat.
Thanks, Rose. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Thanks to everyone who's joining us online as well. We don't see you, but we do appreciate you. This has been a very fast-paced initiative. And so the one thing I didn't really have time to do was memorize my points. So I'm going to apologize to everyone for referring to notes. But I'd like to start today, I'd like to set the stage. I'd like us to hearken back to a different time, to a different era, a historic age, something that I like to call October of 2022. In October of 2022, these things had not happened. Meta, Accenture, and Microsoft had not announced a massive partnership to establish immersive enterprise systems. Elon Musk had not taken over Twitter. The third largest cryptocurrency exchange in the world had not yet collapsed overnight. The European Union's Digital Services Act had not come into force, and no one in the public had had any real exposure to generative AI. None of that had happened in October. By the end of November, all of that had happened. In a 50-day span, in 7 weeks, we were able to get a shape of what we thought was a coming internet age and realized that it's now. It's happening right now. And I don't know a single person who works in this area or in this space who in November and December wasn't reeling, wasn't looking around going, oh my God, what do we do? How do we keep up? Just across the space, there was onset, overwhelming, and so we said, what do we do? What do we do? I think the obvious thing is, of course, you create a task force. But the impetus here was really that we needed to take a beat. We needed to take a moment to situate ourselves, to breathe, to look around, to pull people together who have been doing this for long enough, that they don't respond to a hype cycle, that they've seen trends, that they've seen what sticks and what doesn't, and that they know how to differentiate signal from noise. And we really felt like in this moment, we were at a pivotal space, and we needed to come together and bring a lot of experts together and help us understand what are the broader systems level dynamics that we keep having to navigate? How do we stop playing whack-a-mole with all of these different verticals and these different challenges? And how do we start getting at some of the root causes that continue to land us in trouble? And so with that, we came up with the idea for the Task Force for a Trustworthy Future Web. Part of the impetus behind how we created this task force is that at this exact moment, we've also seen the emergence from industry, American industry, that has driven a lot of our online spaces and a lot of our technological, emerging technologies over the past many years. We've seen the emergence of a field of trust and safety practitioners be developed. This is how companies have innovated the way that they deal with harms that are happening on their platforms, the way that they deal with harms that emanate from the technologies that they produce. And so for over a decade now, we've had these extraordinary teams and people sitting inside of companies who are working so hard to make spaces better, to make technology safer, to make it more accountable. But up until a few years ago, they were more or less kind of trapped inside of companies. Over the past few years, what we've seen is the emergence of a field of practitioners that more sectors and more communities of experts can actually engage with, right? And that is important because this field of practitioners has really deep expertise and really deep knowledge of the nuts and bolts of how these problems can come to pass inside companies, and also how different solutions tried out. And so we looked at that, and we also looked at the emergence of the Digital Services Act, which is a massive regulatory evolution. And we saw how C-suites in companies were really shifting their investments and shifting their focus in order to respond to the emergence of the DSA. And those two things in connection with everything else that had just occurred really inspired a lot of the build and the focus for the Task Force for a Trustworthy Future Web. We focused very specifically on how online spaces have been constructed and have been built, what we know works and what we know doesn't work. And we also constructed on building a very big tent of experts and perspectives to come to this equation. And so we have brought in 40 people from technology policy, from AI, from trust and safety, from advertising, from gaming, from civil rights, from human rights, from virtual reality, from children's rights, from encryption, from information security, community organizing, product design, digital currency, Web3, national security, philanthropy, foreign assistance, and foreign affairs. We brought all of these people together, and we basically said, what do we know? What do we actually know at this moment? What has worked? What hasn't worked? And how could we work more effectively together to ensure that future online spaces can better protect users' rights, support innovation, and incorporate trust and safety principles? And how do we do this very fast? And as I said to all of the task force members when I recruited them, because they didn't believe that we could launch and close a task force in 6 months, you can plan a wedding for 2 weeks or you can plan a wedding for 2 years. And so we just planned this wedding in 2 weeks. And so over the past 5 months, we've had interviews. We've had expert roundtables. We have had virtual convenings. We have done literature reviews. And I'm very pleased today to share with you the report of all of that work. And what it really reflects is the collective insights and the collective expertise, not the individual opinions of any particular task force member, but really the collective findings of a group of people who have been working at this now for decades. And so what you'll see when you go into Scaling Trust on the Web is an executive report that captures the overarching findings, as well as a collection of 6 annexes. And those 6 annexes are a deep dive into some of the areas that the task force felt required specific focus. And those annexes cover the current trust and safety space and how it's been evolving, where open source tooling in trust and safety might be helpful, an examination of the role of children's rights in the consideration of children's safety, an introduction to the gaming industry, an assessment of the trust and safety capabilities of federated platforms, and a review of the lessons that can be learned from the cybersecurity industry, as well as how we can think about the nexus between trust and safety and generative AI. And with that, I want to take you through very briefly some of the fundamentals before we get to our great panel today. So these were the broadest areas of consensus across task force members. And some of these may seem obvious to people who've been in the space, but what was surprising to me is how frequently task force members said, we just want people to understand this. We just want everyone to understand some of these core issues. The first is that that which occurs offline will occur online. There is no magical technology. There is no silver bullet. There is no magical fix that will give us online spaces that are free from racism, that are free from misogyny, that are free from risk, that are free from harm, because we do not live in societies in which that is a possibility. And so it was it was striking to me that so many people on the task force felt that this point consistently needs to be reiterated, because techno-solutionism has been the bane of our existence for many, many years now. Another was that some harms must be accepted as a principle of operating in a democratic society. That if we are going to operate in a free society, we also have to be cognizant that there will be things we don't like and harms that emerge from that that we simply have to accept on the grounds of being in a free society. But that doesn't mean that the choices you make when you're building technologies, and especially when you're building online spaces, are values neutral. In fact, what it means is exactly the opposite. If you know that the society on which you are deploying a technology that you've built is inherently inequitable, is inherently unequal, and contains systemic risks, then you are also on point for thinking about how your technology will scale that, how it will scale malignancy, how it will scale marginalization, and how you work from the outset to mitigate those impacts. You are on point. And I think this is another really key finding from the task force. There are no more excuses. There's no more, oh, how could we have known? No, we know, it's clear, everyone is on point. Finally, risk and harm are set to scale at a really exponential pace if we don't pull together and we don't come up with better and stronger systems. And there is no one key sector or key field that can do that on its own. This is going to be a big group effort. And so we need to figure out ways to work together more efficiently and more effectively. Finally, this is a pivotal moment. This is a task force that is filled with people who, as I said, are immune to hype cycles. Everyone agreed, this is truly a pivotal moment. We have a very narrow window of opportunity in which to build new and take on new approaches and bring in new innovation. And we have to seize that moment right now, or we are going to be in a world of hurt. Because we are not dealing with new problems, but we are dealing with new speed and new scale. And our systems right now are not designed to respond to that. And so we need to focus, and we need to get working together much more quickly. And that was really our goal then in the key findings and the key recommendations of the task force. I am not going to run everyone through all of our key findings and through all of our key recommendations, because I want you all to go and read the report. But there are two very quick things that I want to highlight. One is this concept of the emerging trust and safety field. For a DC audience, I don't think, as a DC person, I don't think this is an area that is necessarily adequately understood outside of industry and outside of Silicon Valley. We have a really unique opportunity. We have a whole new sector of experts and of allies for civil society, for media, for everyone who cares about accountable tech, for people who care about human rights, for people who care about ethical tech, for people who care about tech and society, tech and democracy, a feminist internet. We have access now to a new community of practitioners who are forming their own collectives and who are able to engage with their own expertise. And we didn't have that a couple of years ago. That's new, it's different, and it's important, and it's something that should be leveraged. The second is that within this task force, there was a baseline understanding and a baseline belief in the inherent importance and expertise of stakeholders whose rights and perspectives have historically been marginalized in the creation of online spaces. This includes marginalized communities in the global north. It also includes entire populations in the global majority, which the tech sector still egregiously refers to as rest of world. And it also refers to women, and it refers to youth. And so we didn't question that in this task force. We took that on as a baseline truth, and we operated from that assumption. And third, as I've said before, no one group or sector is able of taking this on their own. And really what this task force report is aiming to do is to give a lot of different individuals and a lot of different experts a way to see an entry point into an area of expertise they may not have, or a group of individuals they may not have. Everyone is part of a jigsaw puzzle. And my hope is that in reading this report and looking through the findings and in looking through the recommendations, that everyone in this space will be able to situate themselves in what it is and find other allies, find other people, find other avenues of entry, and begin to go and engage there. And so with that, we have our key findings. We also have the key recommendations. The key recommendations in the report are very focused on what philanthropy can do, in particular, in this moment, to create actionable, specific work that moves a broad community forward. That's civil society, that's academia, that's folks coming in from industry. It's also government. And so we have a lot of key recommendations there. I think there's 63, 68 for specific work that can be done. And finally, I would like to end by saying I am so, so, so grateful to our task force members for their unbelievable contributions over the past 5 months. It has been a sprint. We have 150 pages of product to show for it. I'm really excited for everyone to engage with it. I hope everyone will check out the website and the reports. I am so deeply grateful to Nikta Khani, the Associate Director of the task force, who has been tireless. Also very grateful to Rose Jackson and Eric Baker and Graham Brookie of DFRLab and the whole DFRLab team for all of their guidance and their support, as well, of course, as Eli Sugarman, Hewlett, and Schmidt Futures. And so with that, I just want to say thank you all for joining. I'm so excited for you to hear our panels today. What we really tried to do with the task force report and with our annexes. Oh, sorry, I should say what's next. We're in New York next week, y'all. You should come. Totally forgot about it. I'm not a good hype girl. So we're in New York next week. Everyone can see it afterwards. And then we're on the West Coast, which is not the best coast, on Wednesday and Thursday. The best coast is the Midwest. And so on the 28th and the 29th, we're going to be in the Bay Area as well. We're also going to have an event at the TrustCon in July in San Francisco. And so what I hope everyone will do is follow these engagements, continue the conversation, read the report, and begin connecting with each other on some of these findings and these recommendations. Naming a problem makes it easier to solve. It's also the thing that you have to do to find solutions. And once you've named some problems and once you've built some foundational consensus, which is what our task force members did, you're in a much better position to start figuring out how to make things better and how to solve. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first and awesome panel today, who's going to walk you through how we can think about generative AI, how we think about solutions, and how we think about opportunities. And so with that, our amazing task force member, Bertram Lee, moderator from Future of Privacy Forum, take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Kat. Thank you so much, Kat, for allowing me to feel like Brian Gumbel for at least a little bit, and to also be on a panel with some of my heroes and some really key leaders in not only the responsible tech field, but the responsible AI field as well. And so I'll start with Dr. Rumon Chowdhury. Dr. Rumon Chowdhury's passion lies at the intersection of artificial intelligence and humanity. She's a pioneer in the field of applied algorithmic ethics, and she is an active contributor to discourse around responsible technology with bylines in The Atlantic, Forbes, Harvard Business Review, Sloan Management Review, MIT Technology Review, and VentureBeast. Dr. Chowdhury currently runs Parity Consulting, Parity Responsible Innovation Fund, and is a Responsible AI Fellow at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. And she's also going to be testifying tomorrow in front of House Science and Technology Committee. Here we, right next to me is Alexandra Reeve-Givens, and Alex is the CEO of the Center for Democracy and Technology, a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization fighting to protect civil rights and civil liberties in the digital age. She is a frequent public commenter, and one of my favorite, to be completely honest, on ways to protect users' online privacy and access to information, and to ensure emerging technologies advance human rights and democratic values. At CDT, Alex leads an international team of lawyers and technologists shaping technology policy, governments, and design. CDT advocates to policymakers and courts in the US and Europe and engages with companies to improve their policies and product designs and shapes public opinion on major technology policy issues. Alex also recently testified in front of Senate Judiciary just last week. And last but not least, our digital friend, Matt. Matthew Sove. Matt serves as head of trust and safety at Spectrum Labs AI, supporting the hashtag TS Collective community, as well as many of our partner companies across gaming, dating, and social apps. He also serves as an advisor for All Tech is Human, focusing on responsible innovation in technology. And as a former member of the Global Trust and Safety team at TikTok, Matt worked on cross-functional teams to develop safety resources on that platform around bullying and harassment and suicide, self-harm, hate speech, election integrity, really needed, and media literacy education and education tools. Prior to entering tech, Matt spent 15 years in education working with diverse high school populations as a teacher and administrator. He is a co-founder of the nonprofit hashtag I Can Help and co-creator of the hashtag Digital for Good. And in 2015, Matt helped start the social media helpline, the first social media helpline for schools in the United States. Please put your hands together for this wonderful panel. And I want to start with you, Alex.
We're gonna just go home after that. Give the bios, cool, take a bow.
I mean, you know, that would be wonderful. But unfortunately, we have questions to ask. I promise not to ask compound questions, as I'm notorious for doing. But Alex, CDT has been at the forefront of the tech and civil rights for years, and especially under your leadership around disability and advocating for marginalized and multi-marginalized communities. Your team recently put out a great report on the limitation of large language models, and you testified to Congress last week on AI. As we see industry rushing to adopt generative AI and policymakers scrambling to determine their response, what are the key points you believe people should be focusing on?
It's such a great question. We are in a moment, and Kat set this up, Rose set this up. One of the things that we are really focused on as an organization is to say, yes, this is an important moment to focus public attention, but also we cannot lose sight of the very real ways in which AI is impacting people's rights and access to opportunity today. I sometimes worry that in the big kind of rush around existential risk in AI, we're losing sight of that. And so a lot of the work that we're doing is saying, yes, focus on those harms, but also let's make sure that we're addressing real world harms today as they manifest. What I mean by that is how AI is used in decision making, impacting people's access to jobs, to housing, to credit, to insurance, how AI is being used to sort people and to screen people in face recognition systems, law enforcement use, et cetera. And I think one of the things that's important is that it doesn't need to be an either or conversation. But actually, when we start thinking about these very specific use cases happening right now, if we can think about a responsible governance approach to those, it lays a really essential foundation and groundwork to tackle some of the longer term issues as well. I'm happy to go into what some of those solutions are, but I think that framing really matters because it also makes it a problem we can address today, right? Things that we can focus on right now.
Dr. Chowdhury, you are an innovator in the responsible AI field and someone who I had the privilege of working with when you were at your previous employer. I don't know if you want to name names out here, but
People know you too well to know.
AKA the Bird app.
AKA the Bird app. And honestly, you were one of my favorite folks in industry to work with because of not only your honesty, but the way in which you conducted your research. And so, because of your innovation, and you also work closely with trust and safety teams inside of industry, you bring a unique perspective to the challenges and opportunities that generative AI presents and how it may interconnect with many of the issues raised in the task force report. What in the current dialogue strikes you as being hype cycle, and what is mission critical? And help us differentiate between the signal and the noise.
That's a great question. It is a compound question. But I think it's important to talk about what is mission critical. There's been a lot of conversation about elections, and the impact on elections is actually explicitly talked about in the report that Chuck Schumer came out with today and his guidelines. I actually share that concern. It's reflected in the report, in the DFRLab report as well. In all social media companies, any company that's taking information seriously and responsibly is very concerned when it comes to election mis and disinformation. This is something that will scale due to generative AI. We have already seen false images being perpetuated intentionally and unintentionally. So now the distinction between mis and disinformation becomes very, very important. It's not just malicious actors making bad things or misleading things. It is also unknowing people looking at something that looks and feels and smells and sounds very, very, very real, sharing it. And even if they find out later that this is false information, it still has shaped their perspective. So I do worry quite a bit about upcoming elections and the role of generative AI in mis and disinformation. In terms of hype, and I'm going to talk about some of these tomorrow in the testimony, I think there is a lot of concern about emergent skills and emergent talents of generative AI and anthropomorphizing the technology to sound bigger than human, smarter than human, better than human. At the end of the day, people make this technology. People are making decisions. And as Kat stated, and one of the things that we as a community try to impart to people is that all technology is values driven. These values are also created by the people who make the tech. So there is no, I coined a phrase years ago, moral outsourcing. It's in our language. It's how we talk about AI does X, AI does Y. It actually doesn't. People make a technology that does a thing. So it's important to parse out when we are attributing an outcome to a technology, we actually truly should attribute it to the people who made the technology.
Thank you. And I think about the Pope in the puffer jacket.
The
meme.
Pope Balenciaga. Everybody brings up Balenciaga Pope.
But, but Balenciaga Pope is actually really interesting.
It's
if you
very
didn't know as a generative model or as
Absolutely.
even as something that's
Hyper-realistic.
Photoshopped, how would you be able to tell the
Right,
difference in that
right.
way? And so that leads me to your work, Matt, as our digital companion, and you have such a phenomenal Zoom background, by the way. Thank you. Matt, you work for a company that offers trust and safety services to a range of companies. Can you explain Spectrum's role for a bit to our DC audience who may be less familiar with the role vendors play in this space? And can you tell us, without exposing any trade secrets, how you are dealing with the influx of generative AI content? Is there anything that you are seeing in the field that gives you pause?
Yeah, I mean, speaking of AI, I'm definitely having my own Max Headroom moment right here, right? So nice little 80s throwback to conceptualized AI. In terms of what we're seeing, well, let me backtrack. Two parts of this question, yeah. Part one, who's Spectrum? So we started using AI almost 4 years ago, looking at and helping clients around gaming, dating, and social. So think Riot Games, Grindr, Udemy, Together Labs, Wildlife, some of our partners, gaming, dating, social, marketplace, that kind of stuff, to really protect from threats, hate speech, profanity, inappropriate conversations on apps, age verification, grooming, and et cetera. We soon discover the higher the risk behaviors, think like radicalization and grooming, are all about people trying to deceive one another over time. So using AI, natural language processing, you could look at stuff in threads versus like keywords or other stuff. You might see a sentence or a comment or a statement of a threat, but there are indicators up to the point that says like, hey, we think something really bad is happening here. And AI can be very good at detecting those high risk behaviors. It does this looking at metadata, user level information, right? So rather than looking at broad behaviors over a course of a platform, it'll look at individual behavior. So moderators, other humans have the ability to go in and make a better determination. Is this person a bad actor? Are they having a bad day? Are they trying to deceive, et cetera? We kind of found what worked even better were aspect models that could even score users on past behaviors, right? So tracking this user level data is very important over time, and doing so in a way that's kind of ethical or understanding that person's life and experience in that particular platform. All of that has helped us really create good, very behavior libraries, intent detection, AI tools that help keep billions of people safe. We process billions of points of data a day. Pretty rapidly, and really help reduce exposure to toxic and hateful content. And that's kind of the dream of AI, right? I think on the one hand, can we keep users safer in order to have a better experience online? And then two, could we really limit the amount of content that moderators and others are exposed to that has been defined as being very toxic and harmful as well? So in order to do that, we've built our very own, essentially large language model of data, working meticulously to label that, working with a lot of academics, developing processes, working with native language speakers to localize. So we sort of have the context in place. And our role at the platforms is kind of taking this layer of protection and just adding it to what they're already doing, right? So as we think about how, whether it's detection models or other stuff, really trying to increase accuracy, source a better signal. When you look at AI, ChatGPT, generative models, and how people communicate, we're rethinking that. We hit, like Dr. Chowdhury, I know we hit on some of the big ones, right? As well as Alex looking at mis and disinfo. We know that has been an existing problem. All we're really anticipating and starting to see is the scale at which that stuff replicates and gets distributed, right? And there's a myriad of challenges there that I'm hopeful in this sense because if you look at who's in the room and connected to this report, is we have government, we have industry, we have content experts working together, which is what it's going to take in order to make sure that AI is deployed not only effectively, but does what it intends to do. And the other part, is I've yet to come across anything in AI at some level that hasn't had to have a human review it, evaluate it, or have some kind of eyes on it. Right, so we're not exactly free. I've yet to be on an AI panel that someone doesn't make a joke about the machines taking over, right? Like that conversation always comes up, but there's a strong human element in thinking about how do we produce that data, label that data, and effectively pull it together. And at the end of the day, like the strength of the data will determine the strength of the AI model, what it's able to do, detect, and otherwise execute in terms of function.
Absolutely, and the data the data issue goes so much farther than I think people realize, particularly along whose data provenance, where did the data come from, who has access to the data, where is the data stored, and how was that data created in the first place, and which communities is it representative from. So I really appreciate that data point, Matt. Dr. Chowdhury, teams inside of companies are often those working most closely with companies like Spectrum, and as well as with organizations like my own, Alex's or DFRLab. I really miss working with you and your team at Twitter. I really bring this up because there are a lack of folks in the AI ethics, compliance, and fairness space as companies, as they are using more AI, not less. And it seems to be a real pullback of those teams. Can you talk about the need of internal AI, fairness, and ethics teams in companies and the important role they play from a trust and safety perspective?
Gosh, yes. So it takes there's multiple levels of impact. There's the first, the very visible part of work that my team did and other teams like mine did, right? There's the audits that we published. We did the first algorithmic bias bounty, opening up our models for public scrutiny. But then there's all the work that people didn't see because bad things didn't happen. And that's fundamentally what a lot of trust and safety people, ML ethics people, privacy and security people do. It's hard to show value at a company when we don't have a shiny widget at the end of our year, right? What we can show is nothing bad happened. And that's something to be very, very, very proud of. People work incredibly hard so that nothing happens. So at the end of the day, it's hard to show and hard to demonstrate sometimes because the more effective you are at your job, the less people need you. When I say need you, I mean something isn't directly on fire. So what I worry about in today's AI fever pitch around generative AI is, first, as I mentioned in my earlier comment, people are attributing a lot to what these actually quite limited models can do because they seem very fancy. And the second part is trust and safety and ML ethics and all the fairness people, we actually have to rethink some of the things we do because a lot of our approaches worked for traditional machine learning models. They don't actually necessarily work for this new wave of highly technical, massively sourced LLMs. The other part I'll add is I actually think now we're reaching a world of two levels of trust and safety. So there are these companies that are making these core models. These are companies like OpenAI, Anthropic, Google DeepMind, et cetera. That there's one layer of trust and safety that happens there. There's also another layer that happens with these vendor partners. So the companies that will build models off of these core models. There's the fine tuning that they do on those models will also have to be trust and safety as well. So there's actually this dual layer of trust and safety that's happening. And I don't know if as an industry we've really organized ourselves that way yet. Traditionally, it's been models, algorithms are code, your values in your data. So in any given company, your deployment of an AI model was simply you took code that was publicly out there and you put your own data in it. Now there's a layer of obscurity and then a second layer of obscurity before it even goes out into the public.
Go ahead,
I
Alex.
was going to say the other thing that I would add in kind of the role and the importance of internal trust and safety teams. Matt alluded to the increasing power of technical tools to help support content moderation. And obviously that is only going to grow in importance as online content proliferates, as generative AI helps there be even more kind of inputs to the system. But the human review is a feature, not a bug, right? It's hugely important, particularly when we're talking about contextual analysis. There are some types of either unlawful content or undesirable content where where you see it, that is an easy decision. But so many more where it really needs to be a contextually based decision. And that's where the human element is essential. And so finding that right balance and making sure that even as we move forward in technological developments, we're not losing the really important touch of the human-driven trust and safety team. The other piece I'll add in this space is that I will say, when I look at the landscape today, we are an organization that historically has cautioned against a heavy regulatory thumb when it comes to online content moderation. And the reason is, as a user-focused organization, we worry about how companies sometimes overreact to the heavy hand of legislation, and as a result, over-moderate or take a simplistic reductionist, like if that's going to be remotely controversial, we're just not going to let it appear on our platform at all. And our answer in those conversations to regulators has been, don't do that. Let's find other levers to make sure that the companies are acting responsibly and with nuance. And I have to say, when you look at the market right now and the investment in trust and safety teams, that argument's getting harder and harder to make. So it is so important that the trust and safety team stay strong, that this field continues to grow. And the recommendations of the report that's been put out, really, I think, lean into that as to why we need to embrace this field, because these questions aren't binary. You need people that can approach these questions with the nuance of being skilled practitioners looking at these questions on the ground.
And Senator Warren highlighted those exact same issues about Sesta Fosta recently, and kind of the backlash and kind of what we didn't think of as a follow-on effect from the implementation of Sesta Fosta and what would happen to the digital ecosystem there. And so as a follow-up question, everything you both spoke about, and Matt, you're talking about as well, investing inside of trust and safety can be seen as a form of voluntary self-governance. But, you both have spoken about kind of the need, and both of your organizations have spoken about the need of independent verification of AI systems and independent governance of AI. So could you all on the panel, and please, you all decide who goes first, or I can pick, where do you all think we need to go in terms of of external governance of AI systems, particularly around AI audits?
I can start. Actually, I didn't even send you my testimony for tomorrow, but you may as well have read it.
Now?
No, like pretty much, just a preview of it. I actually say the phrase governance is a spectrum.
Yeah.
And right now, we're at this pendulum swing where people are like really, really looking at like, we need hard regulation, et cetera. And this is not to say we don't need regulation, but what's worse than no regulation is poorly written regulation, as you mentioned with Sesta and FOSTA. So what we don't need is mandatory algorithmic audits and not enough people who have the skill set to do them, which is the world we live in today. We don't need our mandatory algorithmic audits that are so lightweight that they're actually rather useless, which some would argue that certain audit bills are. What we do need is an investment in the community. So governance takes forms of standards, codes of conduct, norms, education, legal protections. So I'm part of a team running the largest ever generative AI red teaming exercise. Red teaming is really fascinating because it is how companies bring in third parties and sort of currently it's the way it works is under their purview, invitation only. They get closed access to models, and the ask of them is, break this, and then we will try to help us fix it. So we're actually taking that process and we're opening the doors to anybody. We're allowing thousands and thousands of people at DEF CON to come and try to hack at our models, at all of the major large language models with their approval, and they're also part of working with us on it. And what we're trying to do with that is to educate people, to demonstrate that you don't need to be a coder or a programmer to be somebody who has an opinion or thoughts that are of value to identifying the harms in AI models. And importantly, we want to demonstrate that we do need an independent and vibrant community. I think that often goes overlooked. So much of this work is often volunteer-based, and that's very, very difficult. What we actually do need is to protect the people who do this kind of work from litigation and harm, which we've seen in the cybersecurity community, but we also need to cultivate, create organizations and fund organizations that allow people like myself, frankly, to be independent if that's where we are of the most value.
So I strongly associate myself with all of those comments, and I'll add a couple more. So one of the things that I worry about, we talk about the need for there to be meaningful auditing, right? And no matter what regulatory framework you're talking about in any region of the world, this is going to be the key lever that moves forward, right? We might not be able to agree on exactly, but the notion that there should be auditing is kind of clearly a common denominator. But who is doing it? And to what standards are they doing it to make sure that it's not just a race to the bottom and a really easy seal of approval that you get stamped on? This is where tying the conversation around generative AI to some of the longer standing conversations around other AI harms is useful, because they help serve an important warning moment, I would say, as to how we need to approach this auditing question. What do I mean by this? One of the things that we are seeing right now in the move for auditing of algorithmic systems used in employment, for example, is a whole ecosystem of people popping up saying, hey, we're going to do that audit for you. We're going to give the seal of approval on this tool. But what are they measuring for? The things that are really easy to do a quick statistical analysis for. So in the hiring context, we see people do a really quick statistical analysis for discrimination on the basis of race using the traditional US Census categories, and gender using the 2 traditional gender binaries in the US. They don't measure or audit for discrimination on the basis of disability, for example. But you know what? If you use that AI hiring tool and it's discriminating against disabled people, you are in violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. You're still going to face legal liability. But the auditing, because the auditing is a little harder, or it's qualitative, not quantitative, the auditing services haven't stepped up. why am I spending a minute talking about this? It's a good example of why we need the race to the top, not the race to the bottom. And we can't just let auditing be defined by what's easy to measure. We need to be more nuanced and more sophisticated about that.
Matt?
Yeah, you all have given me so much to think about. I'm trying to figure out where to jump off first. There's several things going on here. I was like, when it comes to trust and safety, I always think of trust and safety professionals as like the social workers of the internet, right? It's not only understanding human behavior, but understanding systems of human behavior. So as we think about Gen AI and rolling that out and potential implications, the value that trust and safety brings is really being able to look at data and anticipate where harms could occur. And I think that's a lot of the big backlash coming from a lot of layoffs coming within trust and safety is like who's thinking about these things, right? Because we know in any institution, if you have an issue owner, you have someone who can work towards solving the problem and advocate for it. And that's a challenge looking forward. Another big part of this, I love the call outs on the data, who's thinking about this, how we're thinking about it. It's so important to me to have different groups in this conversation, which we've all kind of hit on, right? Thinking about government's role, thinking about different NGOs and institutional roles. We've seen this with previous, to Alex's point, regulation where it's come out and there are auditing bodies who will come in and help like, hey, we'll get you compliant, right? This has been consistent for a very long time. But thinking about what does that compliance look like? What is the standard of data? There's been a big call to action the past year or two about more transparency from tech platforms, but even if you look at the transparency reports that are currently published, the data that is being referred to or the terms that are being used is not consistent at all across platforms. So without having sort of a unifying identifier, one example within tech is referring to behaviors as being toxic, which is so open-ended and just kind of bland. It tells you everything's bad without telling you anything at all. So trying to have like, how do we break this down further and think about these steps and look at it? And then just data science, I'm a really big believer in not only understanding data, but what is the narrative that the data is telling us, right? And I think having people who are well-informed to kind of understand the work behind it and the goals of what we're trying to accomplish is going to be critical. And trust and safety just kind of brings that, right? It's a different lens coming to the table, particularly if the trust and safety professionals can have some tech background, tech or policy. These teams tend to do a really good job of bridging those gaps.
Can I give one example? Actually ties in like everyone's points.
Yeah.
Really, so really briefly. So my team at Twitter actually did an analysis of our toxic speech identification model. And toxic speech, as accurately mentioned, it is a very vague term. So companies will build machine learning models to say, based on this list of things we know to be, quote, toxic, is this thing toxic? Yes, no. We also know that African American vernacular English tends to be overwhelmingly tagged as toxic speech when it is not. So to your point about nuance, what we did was an analysis of the false positives to demonstrate what are the kinds of speech that are incorrectly being labeled as toxic. And what we found that actually it's not just African American vernacular English, but also it is all reclaimed speech in general. So in general, minoritized communities tend to reclaim the language that is used to marginalize them in order to empower themselves, because it is a societal nuance that a machine learning model will not understand. It does understand that this word equals bad, but they don't understand the context in which it may be used to uplift or to elevate versus being used harmfully. So just an illustrative example of, yes, we can use machine learning, but we still need humans to have the nuance to understand how to make these models better.
It prompts like one more consideration, which is there's a reason why auditing in the generative AI space is particularly complicated, or just content moderation in general, is we could have agreed methodologies, but the agreed standard, like the what, do you allow that reclaimed speech or do you not? Like, we probably want companies to land in slightly different places around that, right? We're seeing it in the deep fakes conversation. Some generative AI companies today will say, we will not allow you to upload and manipulate images of a political figure currently running for office in the United States because they're worried about political deep fakes. There are others who may well make the normative decision like, hey, we should let that happen because people might want to use it for parody. So I actually think this is where it gets really complicated, right? I can jump on my high horse around auditing and hiring because we have employment discrimination laws and we can tell, like, when are you in violation of the law, when are you not in violation of the law. But when it comes to this expressive conduct, actually knowing like what is the right place where we should be landing on these is really hard, and is, I think, it's a nuanced conversation that's going to differ depending on the outlet. So that's an additional complicating factor here too.
So to add context to what you all are doing, when when I was at Ed and Labor. This was the exact conversation I had with a company that was looking at people's social media for toxic speech and flagging them for employment. And so that context is, I think, really important, because I brought up that exact example, right, with more colorful language, and it made everybody uncomfortable, but it brought me great joy. And so I think but it's something to keep in mind. And then also within the context of auditing, Alex, one thing I just want to flag for folks is that the civil rights community for a very long time has used testing as like a critical metric of how to engage in ensuring that civil rights are being abided by in private industry. Testing is a critical measure of how civil rights is enforced and how civil rights is tested. And it is functionally a third-party audit. And so thinking through those contexts about how different organizations and about how different communities think through about what third-party standards are is also incredibly interesting in that context as well. So I think we have time for one more question. And so I think there was recently an ABC report about deepfake porn and the impact that that has on women online. And Congressman Joe Morelli and Congresswoman Yvette Clarke have been at the vanguard of this issue in Congress. But we are still at the beginning of this crisis. And what are some solutions that you all think are feasible to deal with this kind of generative AI? And as a follow-up, I promised I wouldn't ask compound questions, but here we are. As a follow-up, what are some pitfalls that we should avoid when regulating generative AI from the context of US legislation?
I can start with the first part. See, what's really interesting is we have actually had the capability to generate deepfake porn for many years. And there have been some amazing journalists that have been covering this beat and this issue. There also have been multiple attempts at creating deepfake porn generators. I think the most recent one was back in 2018, I believe. It was pre-pandemic, where this individual that was Russia-based was actually selling for $50 the ability to make the code to make deepfake porn. So it's very interesting that this is coming to the forefront as an issue, as if it is a new issue, and it's not a new issue. So the question to ask ourselves is, well, why haven't we been inundated with it previously? So one answer to that question is yes, generative AI makes things a lot easier to build. I think another one is, maybe to put a more optimistic spin, is what has stopped these people in the past? And I know we're talking governance as a spectrum. One thing I find really fascinating is the open source community actually does have strong standards of governance. They have strong community norms, and bad actors are actually kicked out of communities very often. And I think it's worth thinking through what are the ways in which we can carry these standards as we look at more open source and open technologies. So deepfake porn is one aspect of what can happen. We talked about misinformation. These are all actually very similar, different manifestations of a similar phenomenon, right? But in particular, related to your point about deepfake pornography in general, gender-based violence online due to generative AI is also increasing. We are seeing individuals like Maria Ressa, Jacinda Ardern, right? People getting attacks online because disproportionately due to their gender. If they're a prominent woman, whether it's in journalism, some particular field, and especially politicians. So I think it is certainly worth thinking through what's the impact on these individuals and what can be done to protect them. And it's really hard to think of an answer, and maybe to one of Kat's points that she brought up earlier from the report is there are some harms that will exist if we live in a society that is not overly regulated or overly punitive. However, that's not an excuse for it to exist. So what can we do to stop it, in a way that is not creating a surveillance state? That's really the difficult question to answer.
Yeah, again, do I just get to copy paste? I mean, this is one of the hardest trade-off questions in our entire field, right? It's completely abhorrent conduct, but how do you crack down on it in a way that doesn't impinge on lawful speech? A couple things that I turn to. One, I think this is a really important forum where we're going to see how well existing law stacks up. So in the case, a lot of deepfakes involve celebrities or kind of known figures where the copyright law, rights of publicity can actually give a cause of action and can allow the DMCA to be a mechanism. How well does that stack up as a strategy here? How well does that play out? Two, how responsive are the companies to taking down this content? Again, this problem isn't new. Many of them have been active in this space for a long time. But if we see the uptick, which many people are already reporting, the significant uptake due to the ease of access, affordability, and quick scale of these generative AI tools, how quickly are kind of the platforms responding when these images are being posted, and the manufacturers of the generative AI tools themselves. There are safety measures they can take to limit the creation of nude images through their tools, of celebrity images through their tools. How many are deploying that, and how does the market pressure on them to do kind of play out over the coming months?
Matt?
Yeah, I mean, all great points. You know, when you think about deploying, AI, whether it's us as a vendor or other platforms, you're really trying to accomplish something, whether it's kid safe, data safe, user safe, and privacy safe, right? Like those are the goals. When it comes to online safety, Alice Hunsberger has a great triangle, right? But you're trying to balance, user safety with human rights and privacy, and you're going to land somewhere in that triangle. Sometimes you'll land more on the privacy side, sometimes more on the safety side, sometimes like the human rights, whether you want human rights, speech, or other stuff, free expression. And so, trying to balance that as a policy, as a platform, is a constant struggle, because it takes a lot of thoughtful consideration and writing. We talked a little bit about machine learning, and one thing that AI can do when we think about the technology is look at conversations in context, right? It allows for that nuance, and that's something that's new for platforms in the industry, is the ability to not look at a simple sentence or anything else and determine like, well, we're not sure if that's reclaimed language, it violates our policy, we're going to shut this account down. But it really, if the data is done well, it gives the ability to allow for that nuance. And then it's more about a platform's decision of, do we allow this kind of language on our platform? Does it fit within our community norms? The other stuff, I love the healthy communities. This has become one of my favorite stats. And this just comes from my school days. Like, I'm obsessed with culture and climate. And really, if you have a healthy online community, which a lot of platforms are very protective, it will sort of help self-regulate itself. It's not perfect. You still need systems and tools in place to detect unhealthy behavior. But within that, those norms will start to solidify. So looking at beyond AI, platform policies, relationships with regulation, law enforcement, whatever it may be, policy writing, how you structure the types of engagement that happen on a platform are all things to consider that go well beyond Gen AI. Gen AI, any type of AI, it's a tool. And it's a tool, when deployed correctly, can do very good things when it works in concert with all of these other resources. And the other part, beyond the doom and gloom, we've had a few years in tech so far, right? There's not a lot that's new. When the metaverse came out, everyone was freaking out. We have like these new things we got to worry about, and these bad things are going to happen. In reality, like, we have a lot of principles thinking about safety by design and risk assessment frameworks. World Economic Forum, Atlantic Council, others have pulled together resources that platforms can use to look at and evaluate and predict where is the potential risk and harm going to occur. How can we plan for that and put tools in place? And the reality, like, this is a moving target. Right? We know that 80% of problems are caused by about 5% of users. So looking at the rest of that group, we could probably shift a good 60% of that group towards the right direction, right? And we think about healthy behaviors. We can get really good at detecting bad. We can also get really good at detecting good. So as we structure these platforms, we can really start to guide people towards making good things happen. The community helps with that. And we have opportunities to make good things happen, but it's going to come back to that ecosystem of resources and really leaning into our institutional history and seeing like, hey, we've tackled some of this before. Now it's just, it's data, scale, and rate at which this is all happening.
So I want everyone to put their hands together to thank this wonderful panel. It's truly an honor to be here and to be Brian Gumbel for at least an hour. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Kat. Kat?
Thank you so much to Bertram. Thank you to Alex, to Ruman, to Matthew. We are so grateful for all of you, and thank you for that wonderful panel. I wanted to give our audience online a chance to go and take a break. Also, our audience here in the room, we have coffee and water outside if anybody wants to get up and stretch. We're going to reconvene in about 5 minutes with a fantastic panel on national security and its implications with trust and safety. So we'll see you all in about 5 minutes. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Bert, Alex, Rumen, and Matt for that fascinating conversation. The task force report identified 3 areas of emerging technology with the potential to significantly impact the future web. That includes generative AI, immersive and experiential technologies, and decentralized systems. You just heard a panel focused on generative AI. In this next panel, we're going to touch on the second of those trends, the increasing use of immersive technologies, particularly from the gaming industry that is building much of it. But I'm thrilled to welcome 3 panelists here on stage to help us explore this and many other national security implications of the changing web. Today, we're honored to be joined first by Michelle Flournoy, the former Undersecretary of Defense, founder of the Center for New American Security, and co-founder and managing partner of West Exec Advisors, which is a strategic advisory firm helping businesses, including many tech startups, navigate an increasingly complex and volatile international landscape.
Yeah, good to be here.
We next have Lauren Buita, the CEO and founder of Girls Security, which is the only organization dedicated to advancing girls, women, and gender minorities in national security, which includes many aspects of technology.
Thank you.
And finally, Michael Daniel, who is the president and CEO of the Cyber Threat Alliance, a first-of-its-kind organization incentivizing essential cybersecurity-related information sharing across companies. Michael also previously served as the U.S. Cybersecurity Coordinator in the White House. I'm thrilled to be joined by such an illustrative panel. Thank you all for making time to come here today. I think we just heard a lot about generative AI, but I think sometimes people struggle to understand why we talk about national security in the context of social media and the internet and, frankly, even games. Words like Roblox usually don't go in the same sentence as the Defense Department, although maybe now with Discord. I want to start with Michael, though. One of the task force's key findings was that a lot can be learned from mature adjacent fields, and in particular looking at cybersecurity as a possible model for the evolution of the trust and safety field, which is really in its nascence. There's actually an entire annex on that, which you helped us draft. Thank you so much, and I hope people will take a look. But you spent your career focused on cybersecurity, which is now pretty readily accepted as relevant to national security, but that wasn't always the case. So as someone who helped to define that field and the nexus, what can we learn from that experience? And how do you think the issues we're calling trust and safety are really relevant to our national security experience?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me today. I really appreciate the opportunity. I mean, when you look back at where cybersecurity, started, it was definitely true. I mean, Michelle and I were talking about this earlier. It was like the first few meetings in the sit room where cyber would come up, everybody was like this because they were all reading their notes and not, focused on talking to each other. But there were several reasons for that, right, that you were alluding to. One of them was that we treated cybersecurity as if it were purely a technical computer issue. Which it is obviously way more than that. And so part of getting it accepted as a national security issue was realizing its multifaceted dimensions. I think a second part of it was the realization that it was deeply embedded in other issues, right? There was also an assumption from a lot of cybersecurity people that if you didn't take cybersecurity seriously and you didn't do those sort of things, well, you were just obviously stupid. Right, which is not the case. There are other reasons for why people made the decisions that they did. And then lastly, it wasn't as obvious what the harms were until we started having multiple instances of cyber incidents affecting other things. And you could see that play through even all the way through 2021. And the things like Colonial Pipeline finally driving home that you can have an effect in the real world.
That makes a ton of sense. I think what's interesting too is, Michelle, some of what we're talking about really is kind of core geopolitics. And so as the report said, what happens offline is going to happen online. But I think that there's also kind of this new sphere of competition, that tech platforms and tools themselves are something that countries are trying to own and shape and control. You advise companies now that are finding themselves caught in this increasingly complex world. I'm curious how you've seen the role of tech change and the conversation around national security change with it.
Well, I think there's a broad recognition that we are in this much more competitive era that is obviously economic. There's economic competition, there's security competition, but there's also competition across a number of critical technologies. Most focus lately has been on semiconductors, but it's quantum, it's AI, it's biotech, it's so many other areas. And for a lot of companies that have spent the last several decades being told this is an integrated global economy. We want to make China a responsible stakeholder. We want you to invest. We want you to bring them in, et cetera. Now they've done that, and now they find themselves like, okay, well, now I'm completely integrated and dependent either on Chinese supply chains or the Chinese market. And they're really, for a lot of US companies, they're trying to decide, am I a US company acting globally, or am I a global company that I'm trying not to take sides in this competition? But I think they've also realized that in many, particularly for the online, the internet companies, they're the platforms. The platforms are not owned and operated by governments. They're owned and operated by private sector players, and they have a responsibility to try to shape, the standards, the rules of the road, and in many cases, they're, trying to figure out how do we ensure that the internet reflects openness, transparency, privacy, all of these things that they're so precious to our democracy. When you show up at an international meeting, you have Chinese, Russians, others showing up and arguing for a very different kind of internet. So suddenly they find themselves not just as private providers of services, but as public actors in a very public and very substantial high-stakes policy discussion.
Certainly. And if I might jump around a little bit from what we had discussed, but I'm glad that you raised kind of the crowded space of the regulatory environment for a company walking in and having China say you have to do it this way, and Russia say this way, and India this way, and frankly even democratic countries
and
with
EU another way,
deeply disparate versions.
Right.
One of the things that was really interesting, and we've talked about this in the task force, is that almost every conversation we had, someone would raise that the lack of privacy protections in the United States made it really hard to address certain harms that people were worried about. It was almost across the board. It didn't matter if they were industry people, academics, civil society, international, domestic. I'm curious, and this is a question for everyone on the panel, how does the US's more hands-off approach to that rule setting affect our national security, given that you do have many companies, some of which are American, walking into these international spaces where other countries, some of them quite undemocratic, are kind of setting the rules of the road? What does that mean for our national security? Can start with you.
Sure. I mean, I think first of all, it's a real challenge for our companies if they have to try to adhere to multiple different sets of standards or rules. I think most of them would much rather say, okay, US, if you want to just say GDPR is going to be the standard for us, it'll be the global standard, we're fine with that. Let's just have, it's the unpredictability and the multiple, the feeling of being pulled in multiple different directions and trying to actually manage that that's really, really tough. But I also think in the national security space, it really becomes important. It leads into other issues like how do we protect the information of people who are in the national security enterprise? How do we protect the information of Americans that in the wrong hands could be used either for disinformation purposes or other ways that could affect national security? And how do we feel about foreign ownership of certain platforms that, again, could be used to influence American public opinion in ways that might be detrimental to our security in the future? So I think there's a lot of questions that come up. I know the example right now of this is the TikTok issue and whether it should be banned, whether it should be regulated, whatever. But I do think whatever you think of TikTok, there are the deeper issues which it's putting on the table are really, really important for us to address.
And just to build on that a little bit, I mean, the part of the issue there that because we don't have as many of those standards, right, set up for ourselves, when we then start picking on TikTok for privacy concerns, there's a legitimate sort of, well, wait a minute, but what are you holding your own companies? What standard are you holding them to? Mm-hmm. So is this really just about the fact that you hate China? I mean, or is there in fact actually a real privacy issue here? And I think it makes it much harder for us internationally to have those conversations. It also the lack of some of those general privacy standards also puts us at a disadvantage when we have discussions with our European allies. And it means that we have difficulties in dealing with data transfers and other things that serve a very legitimate purpose, and it puts us at a disadvantage on that playing field. And it's largely, I also think, because we have to get out of the mindset that not everybody thinks of the U.S. and the U.S. government as the good guys. We have to set that aside, and we're not very good at doing that.
Certainly. I want to turn to Lauren in a second on that point, but you raised one thing about information sharing, which I think is another really interesting recommendation that came out of the report, which was looking at the experience of the cybersecurity community and finding this intractable problem where everyone was like, okay, I am concerned that the data about Americans using credit cards is just getting taken right and left, and anyone can grab that. That feels unsafe and problematic. Great, we all agree, let's do something about it. Next step, private company. Could you let us know when there's been a breach, and also could you give us the information of private citizens? And you can imagine how that conversation went. And so what was the solution to navigating those tension points between the necessity of privacy, the need to have standards so that government can be trusted in a conversation like that, and how might that look for the trust and safety discussion that we're having here?
Some of it actually really got down to what information are you actually trying to share for what purposes? And when you, and I found this to be true in a lot of different policy areas, when you deal with like large policy issues, particularly, and you're trying to get sort of discussions about them, in some ways that's where the abstract actually hurts you, because what you actually have to get down to is the granular, like, okay, I want to share this piece of information. Is there anything about this that actually, says anything other than something about the bad guy? No. Okay, does anybody care if we share this? No. And it's like, okay, well then go on to the and you literally almost have to go like information type by information type. And once you actually start having those conversations, it starts to dawn on people that you're not really talking about just this abstract sharing of stuff, but it's about very specific kinds of information for very specific purposes. When you get to that level, then that's how you can actually make progress. And you also set up rules about it. We are going to use the information for these purposes, not for these purposes over here. And you set up the guardrails, for that. And that proves true whether you're talking about sharing between the private sector and government or between private sector companies, like what my own organization does. So I think you have to drive that to the specifics instead of staying up at the abstract level.
Absolutely. And I think right now the conversation in Europe around the Digital Services Act is opening that moment for everyone on connective technologies. But we just talked a little bit about TikTok, and I think it's kind of hard to have a conversation about TikTok and not observe the kind of insane gulf between what that conversation looks like, frankly, here in Washington, D.C., and some of the boardrooms in Silicon Valley, and within the communities, Lauren, that you work often with, of youth that are coming into this ever-present digital world. And coming in to be the next generation of people that will make decisions about our national security. What do you think are the greatest moments of opportunity right now, and are there things that the national security community is getting wrong right now?
Yeah, I think there's more opportunity than there is the possibility of error, especially if you believe that securing the blessings of liberty for our posterity and promoting the general welfare are integral to providing for the common defense. And I think the national security community has long missed an opportunity to engage youth. If youth movements around climate change and gun violence are an indicator, there's a really crucial space for young people to be involved in national security. Certainly, it didn't hurt that the Department of Defense was also concerned about climate change, but I think youth have a really vital role to play within this conversation. And they have a very unique perspective. And we talked a little bit about this before. I'm always reticent to call young people digital natives because I think they really lack a lot of constructs and frameworks for the digital landscape. However, they understand democracy. And one of the refrains that we also hear a lot of is, the American people are focused on Russia and China, or they're not focused enough on Russia and China, they're preoccupied with domestic issues. Well, we can both prioritize the intellectual property threat posed by China as well as threats from Russia, while also dealing with the fissures in our own democracy, of which data and the internet are a huge aspect of. And so there's a lot of opportunity around training up that future workforce, which we were talking about, as well as education initiatives, which shouldn't be borne solely by civil society organizations. And I think there's a great opportunity for the media as well, is within the national security sort of media sector. I think there's an opportunity to engage media around how are we reporting on national security issues so that we can broaden the aperture of the public and so that young people can also feel like they're part of the discourse as well.
Absolutely. And I think a little bit later in the conversation, we'll have some more entry points on youth, and particularly in the gaming sector. But you brought up the question of workforce. And so, Michelle, I want to turn to you briefly. You know, prior to your current role really helping companies understand how to grapple with geopolitics, you were previously serving in very senior roles in the U.S. Defense Department, and I'm assuming plenty of tech issues coming on your plate. Looking at this next phase of the digital world, what do you think leaders should be thinking about that they're not, and in particular, how we staff and resource our government to be able to serve the interests of the American people?
Yeah, I mean, I think given that we are in an era where there is a true revolution going on, we've talked about the digital revolution, we're now talking about the AI revolution, cybersecurity continues to evolve, and as it starts to leverage AI and move at machine speeds, it's already happening. I mean, so one of the challenges in government is we don't have the tech literacy in general among policymakers, and we don't have the tech talent in the sufficient quantities to be smart policymakers, smart advisors, smart procurers of technology, smart managers of technology, smart users of technology. And so I think, and there have been some wonderful sort of pilot efforts, you know, fellowships that bring tech talent in for a period, or take military or civilian personnel and put them in tech companies for a number of weeks. But I think it's kind of a soda straw, and we really need to like open up the floodgates. So I actually think this is a part of the National Security Commission on AI recommendations that still need to be implemented. But creating a digital reserve, you know, going out to the digital ecosystems that are just absolutely at the cutting edge in this country. Modifying the rules, you know, you don't have to pass a PT test or get rid of your tattoos or whatever it is, but you can serve your country as a civilian reservist in tech. That would be huge. A digital service academy, where it, like we do with military academies, where you get a free quality, STEM, you know, high tech, you know, great education, and in exchange you owe the government a period of service to start your career. And that may become a full career, it could just be 5 years. So I think we need to sort of create some more institutional kind of superhighways to incentivize and bring tech talent in. And then once it's in, we're abysmal managing it and retaining it. And so we've got to have real career paths for technologists in government. Even if we acknowledge that government's not going to be developing the cutting edge technology, to use it to make sure the governance is correct, the testing and evaluation, the trust and safety, the policy frameworks, all of that, you need that tech advice and literacy. So I think this is an area where we could make some progress, significant progress, and people have laid out some really great ideas. We just need to get Congress and the administration on board to implement some of them.
Absolutely.
Can I add to that as well briefly?
I was going to ask, you've done so much work on how do we even define what workforce means?
Well, and I think part of it too is getting the private sector and the national security community to have a conversation openly about the extent to which our national security relies on the private sector, especially in the trust and safety space, where you have such a significant flow of professionals from the federal government flow into the private sector. And I think trust and safety is such a unique space in the sense that it does bring this sort of social justice component to play, which so many young people are activated by. So once again, I think if we can get the sectors talking and being, as Michelle said, intentional about how we define pathways in and out of government, we'll be able to create that sustainable pipeline. And I think as we learned from cybersecurity, if we want a diverse pipeline of diversely skilled people, especially those who are often the canary in the coal mine and experience the digital harms that are online, we have to start quickly and we have to make pathways as accessible as possible.
I'm so glad that you raised the kind of canary in the coal mine dynamic. Because one of the things we certainly know online is that the most vulnerable in society not only are most affected by harms online, but they're usually the first to experience them. And so one of the things that came out of the task force was certainly that, even if you don't care about what's happening in the rest of the world, you don't care about human rights, you could have a cold, cold heart. You still needed to have some interest in knowing what's happening elsewhere because it will eventually manifest for you. The internet is systemic. Michael, we've talked a little bit about how important it was in the cybersecurity world to really build an ecosystem and not think of it as necessarily that the government alone was going to be able to solve a problem or that a single company was going to be able to solve a problem. Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like in practice and what it means to be able to have a full community capable of playing its role?
Yeah, so when you look at like the issues that we deal with in cybersecurity, right, and you actually look at the way that the entire ecosystem is put together. I mean, the first thing that you actually start to realize is that if your image of the bad guy hacker is some disaffected white dude still living in his mother's basement wearing a hoodie, like that is not the adversaries that we face, right? I mean, there's still a few of them around, but like that's not the total of the adversaries that we face. The adversaries that we face are highly organized. They've read their Adam Smith. They've read their Harvard Business School cases. They run a lot of these operations on the criminal side like a business. They've got extended supply chains. They've got vertical integration and horizontal distribution. And I mean, it really is like an entire ecosystem. And so the idea that any single entity is going to actually have a view and an understanding of that entire ecosystem all by itself is just ludicrous. Nobody is actually going to have the resources or the analytic capability to actually understand the entirety of that complex ecosystem. And so if you want to actually disrupt that ecosystem, whether you want to make it less profitable for the criminals, you want to make it harder for the intelligence operations of our adversaries, whether you want to dampen down those that are using it for disinformation or other purposes, you actually want to understand how to actually affect the ecosystem as a whole. And to do that, you actually need to combine the insights and understanding from a whole bunch of different sources. And that's really where the cybersecurity industry is evolving now, is really trying to understand how you put together those comprehensive sort of views and understanding of that entire ecosystem. And it's still a work in progress because culturally it's very hard to let go of, like, I've got this awesome source of information and now I'm going to share that with other people. But the ones that have fully embraced that transition realize that that actually makes them more effective at whatever part of the cybersecurity ecosystem they're working on. It makes them more effective at their part of that. And that's really the driver behind it, is that that need to actually have that impact on the adversary. But I'd say these lessons have been hard learned over 15 or 20 years.
Yeah, and Lauren, I think that also speaks though to some of the work that you've been doing on. It's not just that it should be a diverse community of people doing this work because that's the right normative value, but because it's the only path to success. Do you want to speak a little bit to why that is?
Yeah, I mean, back to the privacy issue, I mean, we have an entire generation of young people who are exploring, there's norm shifts happening where their expectation, their subjective expectation of privacy looks very different from what it did to prior generations. And so I think we make a lot of assumptions about the extent to which the next generation understands digital technology. So I think there's just an opportunity around sourcing and understanding what those norm shifts look like, which usually in national security, when norms are shifting, we start passing laws and making policies, when in fact I think this is a moment in time that we need to hit pause and really understand what are the experiences of diverse communities online. The latest statistic was 2020, where only 2/3 of the world students, school-age students, had access to the internet. So we're making assumptions about how youth are engaging, what their perspectives are on privacy, who has access around the world, and at least from our perspective, really digging in deep to understanding how entire generations of young people who are the future workforce, again, going back to posterity, this is about the future of the workforce, the future of humanity. It's doing a deep dive, doing analytical research on understanding what those norm shifts look like, and making sure that we're actually developing solutions that can leverage those unique experiences of future generations who are going to exist in a very different world based on all of the things that we're talking about today that were also included in the report as well.
Absolutely.
I mean, if I could, just one more thing on in this space too, like we see this all the time. So the it's not just a theoretical thing that like the diverse teams are more effective. Like you actually see this in the ability of cybersecurity researchers and things to understand what the bad guys are doing, and the more diverse teams are more effective at that. One of companies that we work with, a huge number of their really, really good penetration testers come from Hollywood, literally come from the acting industry. Why? Because actors put themselves in the mindset of other people all the time. That's what they do. And so it turns out they're really good at doing pen testing.
Weaponized empathy.
Who knew that you could actually, draw on that? So this company has made a great business out of hiring people who went to Hollywood thinking maybe they'll be an actor but didn't quite make it, and they're looking for an alternative career path. And it's sort of funny to say it like that, but I mean, it's a very concrete example of how non-traditional career paths actually can play a huge role in cybersecurity and really make a meaningful difference. And like, nobody would have thought of doing that, certainly a few years ago, of looking for that
skill set.
skill set in that community.
That's interesting. I want to, with the time that we have remaining, turn to a little bit of an emerging tech theme. And I'm glad that you brought up the question of how many people in the world are actually not connected to the internet. I think it's been a topic of geopolitical conversation for some time now, that certainly countries like China, with an authoritarian viewpoint and aim in the world, are investing significantly in bringing more people online into a version of the internet and a connective world that certainly will be at least not friendly to rights, if not straight antagonistic to rights. But it goes beyond just the question of what fiber someone is running the internet off of, or the digital Silk Road. I'm going to claim a little bit of moderator's prerogative here for a minute to set the scene, because I think this is an area that's a little bit newer to most people. We're seeing persistent, systematic, and pretty significant investments from Saudi Arabia and China into Western gaming companies, which, if you don't know a lot about gaming, probably seems like a pretty weird thing that I'm going to mention this here and that you should care about it. But not only do 3 billion people play games around the world, it's estimated that by 2026, the market for games is going to be about $300 billion, which is a lot of money. Sounds like funny money to me. I have trouble with numbers that large. But a lot of this report, we actually have an entire section deep diving into this and trying to demystify this industry. What's really interesting is that a lot of the virtual technology that, if you remember, Kat referenced the 50 days in the fall where everything was happening. Prior to the release of ChatGPT, the #1 thing everyone wanted to talk about was the metaverse, whatever that was supposed to mean. And so everyone was quite focused on, what should we think about immersive technology in the immersive world? Most of that tech is built by gaming companies. And across the board, you have companies like Tencent, you have the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund, and a number of other Chinese-backed firms taking majority stakes, if not full ownership, of the majority of that infrastructure, which is an interesting dynamic for us to watch. So we put that in the report because we think it's an underexamined sector that people are trying to build their own influence, and we should be paying attention. I wonder if I can allow us to all just have a little bit of fun conversation on the basis of that information here. And Michelle, starting with you, what do you think we should make of these moves? And as someone who has spent a lot of time thinking about the geopolitical implications of investment and of how technology interacts with our national interest, what might it mean for American companies to be answerable to government-backed or, frankly, government investors themselves?
So you're going to inspire my inner paranoid to come out. So I think there are several things. One, I mean, games are all about narratives, and so you can't imagine, a states-backed company using games to inject narratives into American society or whatever at a very broad level. And sort of influence public opinion on other issues. But the thing that really worries me is, my youngest son became quite a gamer during the pandemic, and it's not just about the playing of the game; it's the chat that happens during the game, and the fact that a lot of times you don't really know who you're chatting to. And I do worry that, combined with other information, a foreign government could try to identify U.S. military members or members of the intelligence community or law enforcement, whatever, and use a gaming platform to try to engage them personally, develop. I mean, it's another, platform for espionage or for recruiting or for what have you. This is the inner paranoid part. But I think it's combined with other information. It is another way of targeting people you want to target, and and learning about them by observing them and their behavior in a gaming context.
Absolutely. Lauren, I mean, I think one of the interesting things is that it sounds crazy for me to start talking about gaming in a national security conversation because people mistakenly think that games are for kids, even though I can't remember the exact number, but the majority of people that have played digital games online are actually adults.
Yeah.
But particularly working with youth, I assume that the conversation looks a little bit different about gaming and how people are interacting with that and what it might mean.
Yeah, I mean, we talked a lot about TikTok. I never thought I'd say TikTok so much in my life, but when I think young people understood that the federal government was explaining that TikTok posed a threat because of the potential for algorithms to be manipulated, for information to be weaponized, especially around identity-based groups. And I really don't mean this as a zinger, but I feel it's important to point out, because a lot of youth in our program mentioned it, the White House was also hosting TikTok influencers. Yeah. And so we had a lot of young people saying, all right, what's all this TikTok nonsense about? But the reality is that, again, youth have the capacity to understand national security challenges. And I think it really is a matter of simply engaging and empowering them with information about what those challenges look like, because they do occupy the gaming space. But again, if we want to build up a sense of societal resilience around these issues, if we want to grow trust in institutions, which is declining, we need to provide young people, especially who are predominantly in the gaming community, with information. Also, a large percentage of gamers are girls or female identifying individuals. As we always say at Girl Security, girls are born in a world where they're taught to fear everything, but often secured from nothing. So once again, you start to see the same types of gendered threats online, which again, it just adds a layer to the experiences of already marginalized communities, not only within the gaming context, but then again, within the context of how we communicate and socialize online as part of a global community and so forth. So I think there's a lot of layers where we're just big proponents of give youth the credibility that they deserve. They can have hard conversations, and we owe them, for posterity, the opportunity to learn about these issues. And gaming's the perfect platform because it's where they coexist.
I want to pick up two things that you just said there, and then we'll come back to you, Michael, on this question. The first is you raised the kind of tension between, one part of the government focused on the national security threat of TikTok, and another part of the government focused on the political potential of leveraging TikTok. I wonder, and this is a question for anyone here, how is it that, do we think that the US government right now has the structure and capacity it needs to bridge what are the same platforms and conversations happening in very different spaces, if it's domestic or international policy?
The question is, does the government have the capacity? I think the government certainly has the capacity to do many things, but I think with respect to bridging these platform or these different issue areas, I think it would take a lot of strategic thought, a lot of investment, and again, a lot of expanding how we define our national security priorities, which requires breaking down silos. It requires cross-cutting training. It requires convenings and a high level of investment. So I think we have the capacity to do it. I think it's more the time and the will to actually commit to it, because again, we often seek short-term solutions. We're working on the long game in the digital space, and so I think it just is going to require a heavy level of commitment across potential administrations amid already politically divisive times. And again, that's where I think youth, as we've seen in our program, they're so civically minded, even if statistics around their civic understanding is low, they are civically oriented, and so they provide the perfect sort of lever to empower in these spaces to help drive government and the private sector to make these types of changes.
I think there's a huge educational component, though, to your point, that how do we help not just young people, but any user of the internet become more educated? To recognize malign behavior, to recognize potentially someone pretending to be someone they're not, to recognize, to look at the DNA of your data, what is with all the potential for misinformation, disinformation, now deep fakes, are there ways that we can educate people to, whether approaches of tagging or where you can sort of give much greater transparency to the source of the data, the journey of the data, the journey of the image, the journey of the voice print, to educate people to be much more sophisticated consumers of what they're getting off of the web, and to recognize that, okay, this piece of information that I'm reading in an American newspaper, actually it came out of a planted Sputnik article, 20 iterations ago. Or this is a video that looks, because it has these various attributes, looks like it was probably a fake. But I think there's a huge public information component to getting all of us to be much more discerning, sophisticated users of the internet.
I can promise everyone I did not pay Michelle Flournoy to say that the DFRLab's work is an essential component of our national security, but thank you for that. Michael, I wonder if I can turn to you real quick on the question of augmented and virtual reality and what that means for how that technology is built, likely to amass more and frankly more sensitive kinds of data, already moving into the ecosystem that we discussed that doesn't have a lot of clarity or protections for people. You work with companies every day on situations of data security, requests from governments. What do you think we should be paying attention to? And is that a space that we're ready for?
So I think one of the things that we should be paying attention to, it actually goes back to something that Kat said at the very beginning, which is that, technology is not neutral, right? And there's a lot of what I refer to as digital utopianism that has been baked into the way that we have thought about technology. And a lot of times the people that are developing this technology, they're usually motivated because they see an opportunity. They see this huge opportunity to do something good in many cases. And as a result, it's very hard for them to imagine that anybody could actually put their technology to malicious use. I saw this over and over and over again, even in some technologies where we would have a discussion and the CEO would be talking to us about this data that they were amassing and how it could do all these things, and I'd be like, wow, to your point, like, wow, that's a really powerful counterintelligence tool. I'd really like to know that about that person to recruit them. And the guy's sitting there like this, like it never occurred to him that anybody would misuse the platform for that. And so I think the fundamental thing is we have to go into this knowing that there are people that will misuse and abuse those platforms and misuse and abuse that data to do bad things. You have to go into it knowing that that is going to happen. Not might happen, not could happen, it will happen. And so you have to bake in those, we talk about the lessons from cybersecurity. This is like what you don't do. Bake it in later or try to bolt it in on top of it after the, we can mix metaphors, after the cart has already left the barn or whatever. You don't want to be doing that. You want to build the security protections in. You want to be asking those questions early about how is the data going to be used? What is it going to be used for? How long are you going to keep it? How are you going to protect it? What are you going to do to actually get rid of it when you don't need it anymore? And don't fall prey to the, well, we could just keep it because someday we might use it, fallacy. So I think a lot of that is really that mindset of going in, knowing that these technologies can be used for ill and planning accordingly.
Yeah, I appreciated that you referred to it as your inner paranoid. Because
I have a fellow traveler.
Yes. Well, no, I always joke that this is mostly my job in tech, is to be the red teaming person telling you all of the ways in which something bad could happen.
Yeah, right.
But I think it's a helpful way to get people focused on where there may be holes in how we're having conversations. If it's Amazon purchasing One Medical, and people wearing increasing amounts of biometric gathering information, things like this Oura ring that I have. I am not immune to it, or the Apple Watch that I wear almost every single day. What are the rules around where that, does HIPAA extend to protect my data privacy from an Apple Watch? If I use an Oculus Rift and start playing a virtual reality game and it measures my temperature and my pupil dilation, is that allowed to go into my medical history? Can insurance companies make decisions off of that? And as much as that might sound like an inner paranoid question, we have to ask those questions to set rules and have answers for them. And I think that's why I'm so grateful to this group being willing to have these discussions across boundaries that often we get stuck in silos. I do want to come back to one thing that you said when we were talking about gaming, which is you mentioned gendered harassment and the experience that girls often have walking into a digital space in which they have no protection. That really resonated because it's not just girls.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we talk about a lot within the DFRLab and some of our partners and all around the world is the consequence of digital spaces that are hostile to half of the world's population participating, particularly when those spaces are essential for democratic participation. Yes. They're essential if you're an elected official for being able to use them. And I think this conversation brings forward that they may be essential to having pathways to serving in government and making decisions about societies. What have you seen as promising steps that can be taken? And what did you learn through the participation in this report about what we should be doing about that problem as something that does actually affect not only our democracy, but our national security?
I mean, I think of a group of girls from Afghanistan who we provided a cyber training for last summer. They were brought here, they were given cell phones, and within a week they were removing their hijabs and posting locational images. And it was really challenging for the organization that was shepherding them. And so we were working with these young people to sort of help understand, how do you exist in an online space coming from an oppressive area where you want to flourish and sort of be able to explore this new aspect of your identity online, and how quick they were to be able to balance those concerns. And I think one of the things that we always talk about with certain populations we work with, especially those who've suffered a lot of trauma, is not disempowering targeted populations, because the last thing you want is for them to be scared online, which probably is why I'm a bit more of a Pollyanna idealist. Is we have to generate a message that there is levers of change for them, that they can be activated. And I think one of the aspects of the child safety report that I felt so strongly about was young people need to engage in risk-taking behavior if we buy into social science, which is that it's a crucial aspect of their development. And so if we remove that, if we remove those spaces for them to engage in that risk-taking behavior, what does that look like for, again, historically targeted and marginalized populations who are harassed online? And so I felt really inspired by that conversation, because that is a big proponent of how we are big proponents of creating those spaces, preparing people who are targeted, but also creating those spaces where they can engage in risk-taking behavior, because it is so vital for adolescent development. So I'm really looking forward to following up on some of the parts of the Child Rights Annex, because I think that child's right perspective is so vital for vulnerable populations, because the last thing we want to do is disempower them online.
That's really, really wonderful. I think we're coming towards the end of time, so what I want to do is give each of you the chance to say any final thoughts, things you think that we haven't considered, key takeaways about why this matters for national security, or what you hope people walking away from this conversation will start thinking about and engaging with. If I can start with you, Michael.
Sure. I mean, I think at its root, when you talk about what do we mean by safety, right? You're talking about protecting people, protecting not whether it's individuals or groups or whole societies of people from harm, whether that's mental harm or emotional harm or physical harm. And I can't think of anything that's more core to national security than that. So to me, the connection into national security is it's a very clear path.
Wonderful. Michelle?
Yeah. Well, as we obsess in this town right now about regulation and AI, I would like to I suggest that we should start at a higher level with a set of principles and norms. And if we can agree on those and use those to be designed into the technology as it gets developed, I think the regulation, will come, but you've got to know what problem you're trying to solve, what norm you're trying to reinforce, what kind of behaviors are you trying to encourage and discourage if you're going to regulate well. And so I'd sort of elevate the fundamental conversation to this question. And I think there's a lot of good grist for the mill in your report of what are the key principles, what are the normative guardrails, if you will, that we're trying to enshrine, and then figure out how to do that.
Excellent, thank you.
Regulation.
Lauren?
It's hard to follow up on those two
I know,
comments,
right?
but I feel like the words trust and safety, sometimes I feel like Tom Hanks in Big, like my brain is always stuck in adolescent mode, but I think the concept of trust is so simple, but it's such a foundational aspect of not only adolescent development, having those trusted relationships, but also of our democracy. And so I think if you believe that a strong democracy is vital to our national security, then you should pay attention to the issues impacting youth and make them part of that conversation, because I think they're the greatest untapped national security resource that we have, and I don't think we can afford, I think it would be a gross miscalculation to continue to leave them from the discussion tables and decision-making tables as well.
Thank you. I think if there's one thing to take away from this entire report, and certainly this conversation, is that the strength of any solution to these problems is going to be dependent on so many different people with so many different perspectives and expertise coming together. And one of the worst things I've witnessed in tech conversations is people's belief that they don't know enough to participate, or that they're not technical enough to have a contribution. And I really hope that this conversation brought home how essential it is that all of us are part of this, that it is an urgent conversation to have. I hope that all of you will join us again for more of the work to follow, and really appreciate you taking the time to help us launch this and write the entire report to begin with. Thank you.
Thanks, Pete.
Thank you.
I'm now going to turn to Graham Brookie, our Senior Director of the DFRLab, to close us out, and a giant thank you to all of you for staying with us for so long today. Thank you, guys.
Thank you to my stalwart colleague, Rose Jackson. And thank you so much to the panelists, Lauren, Michelle, Michael, the panelists in the previous session, Bertram, Alexandra, Michael, and Rahman. My job is purely logistical. My name is Graham Brookie. I'm the Vice President of Tech Programs here at the Atlantic Council. My job is to be thankful for the opportunity to learn from this community every single day. So thank you to the panelists. Thank you to the task force members, 40 plus that have spent time with us, and advisors. I would be remiss to not mention the advisors, but most particularly the staff that has done this amount of work in the last 5 months. An enormous amount of work. As Kat laid out the stakes, I think when we launched this task force, any number of things had not happened yet. And by the time we're done with this conversation today, we're going to be moving from ChatGPT 5 to ChatGPT 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 or something like that. So we'll check in on that as a task force as soon as we wrap today's event. And huge thank you to Kat Duffy, the task force director. Huge thank you to Nikta Khani, the associate director of the task force, and the entire DFRLab team that made this possible today, including the global team that is not with us here in Washington, D.C. Huge thank you to the supporters of this task force, Eli Sugarman, the Hewlett Foundation, and Schmidt Futures. And most particularly, thank you to you all who have joined us either online or in person today. You're now part of a growing community, and there's clearly a good amount of work to do going forward, including checking which version of ChatGPT we're on after this event. So thank you so much for spending the time today, and thank you so much for your continued commitment to being a part of this group. Trust and safety, in my opinion, we're in Washington, D.C., and at the beginning of next week, we'll be in New York. The end of next week, we'll be in San Francisco. But today, we're in Washington, D.C., so I would be remiss if I didn't say that the trust and safety teams, the trust and safety community that you all are part of, in my opinion, are this kind of jump team for democracy. And so the role that it plays in national security or foreign policy, the conversation that we're having today in Washington, D.C. at a foreign policy think tank, is that this is the team that is committed to the systemic promotion and protection of rights at, as Fred said at the very beginning of today's event, a critical inflection point in which we get to decide what technology's role, an increasing role in society looks like, and especially in an era of global competition for information around the world. And so now we're all a part of it. Congratulations. Thank you for your work. Thank you for your continued work. The last logistical note for today is that I hope you get to spend some time with the report on the internet, which is where we're consummately at. If you're engaging with us online, the hashtag is #ScalingTrust, and the report can be found at atlanticcouncil.org. For those of you in person, most importantly, there's a reception afterwards, and next door there are refreshments, and we will see you there. Thank you so much.